Hello there, and welcome to Whispers of Earth, the place where we let curiosity wander without a timer and give big questions the time they deserve. This isn't the sort of space for rushing through bullet points or hurrying to the end. Tonight, let's drift backward into a planet that feels both familiar and utterly other, an Earth wrapped in cold light, where slow rivers of ice pressed across continents and great animals wandered beneath a pale sky. This wasn't a single frozen moment, but a long, breathing era, an ice age made of many pulses. Glaciers advanced like patient tides. Warmth returned in intervals we now call interglacials. Then the cold gathered itself again. Whole lifetimes passed while the world changed by inches. And yet, over those inches, mountains were planed, valleys were deepened, oceans fell and rose, and the paths of our own ancestors bent toward new horizons. Before we reach for the science, settle in. Imagine the hush that follows soft snowfall, the way sound feels rounded, like footsteps absorbed by the world itself. Hold that hush as we open a slow map of deep time. Picture a northern horizon with no cities, no roads, only a wall of blue-white ice lifting hundreds of meters high, its face veined with cracks that catch the thin sun. The air is dry and sharp. Across the open steppe, shaggy herds move as a single dark line. Mammoths and bison excavating winter grass with sweeping tusks and heavy hooves. Predators keep their distance. Cave lions melted into the light. Dire wolves arranging themselves against the wind. Far to the south, life is different, but never absent. Forests and broad rivers endure where the ice did not reach, and small human bands cook their evening meals over coals, trading stories as sparks drift into cold air. Here is the first important thing to hold. The Ice Age was a rhythm, not a lock. The planet's orbit stretched and relaxed. Its axis leaned a little more, then a little less, and even its slow wobble changed the way sunlight arrived. Over tens of thousands of years, these subtle motions nudged summers cooler or warmer, tipping the balance between snow that melts and snow that lingers, between seasons that erase and seasons that accumulate. In the long, patient arithmetic of time, lingering snow hardens into ice, ice begins to flow, and a continent learns a new shape. As the ice grew, seas fell, shorelines walked outward, land bridges rose between places that today are divided by water, broad tundra corridors where hoofprints wrote the first drafts of migration. Asia and North America met across a cold, windswept plain. Europe reached farther into the North Sea than any modern map will show. Dust rode hard winds, settling in pale blankets that would one day feed harvests, though for now they simply recorded the breath of a colder sky. The second thing to hold is quieter. This world was not empty. It adapted. It moved. It endured. Under snow, rodents tunneled in steady warmth. On the open grass, giants grazed. At cave mouths, human hands stitched hide to hide and carried the small miracle of fire from place to place. If you stood there, if you could listen long enough, you would hear it. A low groan from within the glacier, the muffled thud of a distant herd, the soft human murmur that means we are here, we are learning, we will try again tomorrow. To understand why the world breathed in ice, we have to listen for rhythms too slow for any single lifetime. Imagine 3 metronomes ticking beneath everything we do. The first lengthens Earth's orbit into a slight ellipse, then rounds it again. The second tilts our planet's axis a touch more, then eases it back. The third makes the axis gently wobble like a slow spinning top. Over tens of thousands of years, these motions change how sunlight is delivered to the high latitudes, summer by summer, snowflake by snowflake, until a small excess of lingering snow hardens into the first threads of a glacier. Given time, threads become a river of ice. The feedbacks are patient but powerful. Fresh snow shines, bouncing sunlight back into space and keeping air cooler, so more snow lingers. As ice spreads, sea level falls, exposing raw shelves of land to bitter wind. Dust rises and drifts, whitening distant surfaces and feeding future soils. Meanwhile, oceans inhale and exhale heat like vast lungs. Their currents, deep, slow rivers within the sea, can carry warmth northward or hold it in southern basins. A slight shift can tip coastlines toward frost or thaw. None of this is dramatic in the moment. It is the arithmetic of centuries. Locked inside the ice itself is a diary, bubbles of ancient air. If you held a clear cylinder of glacier in your hands, you'd be holding the breath of long-vanished summers. In that breath, the balance of carbon dioxide and methane tilts with the climate, lower in the deepest cold, higher in the gentler warmth between. Greenhouse gases are the planet's thin quilt. Thicken it slightly, and evenings hold their heat. Thin it, and summer nights surrender their warmth back to space. The quilt changed as the world changed, and the world changed as the quilt did. Cause and effect braided together until even the cleverest models must trace the braid strand by strand. Life answered in form and habit. On the mammoth steppe, an ocean of grass stretching from Iberia across Siberia into Beringia, giants thrived by being efficient. Long hair for insulation, fat reserves banked like winter savings, curved tusks to sweep snow aside. Predators learned patience, shadowing herds across horizons that never ended. Smaller lives were no less ingenious. Voles tunneled in the subniven layer, a cozy space between earth and snow, harvesting seeds where the wind could not reach. Arctic plants hugged the ground, blooming fast in brief summers and caching energy below the frost line. Humans, too, adjusted their choreography. Needles of bone and antler-stitched fitted clothing. Stone flaked into leaf-thin blades and spear points that held an edge against hide and meat. Fires were banked and carried, a living ember between camps. Stories did the same work as fire, preserving lessons against the next hard season. Where the ice retreated, people followed game into newly opened valleys. Where it advanced, paths bent south toward milder rivers and forests. Each migration wrote another line in the long poem of becoming us. And still, through all this movement, the world was never silent. Ice creaked. Wind sang. Water found seams in the rock and wore them wider until an entire valley was carved by persistence alone. If you step quietly into that hush, you can hear the lesson. Great changes are built from small ones, repeated faithfully. Ice looks solid, but under its own weight it behaves like a slow river, creeping, deforming, carrying the world a grain at a time. Give it centuries, and it will take hold of a mountainside and patiently change its grammar. V-shaped river gullies are pressed wider and deeper until they become U-shaped valleys with high, clean shoulders. Where the glacier bites hardest, it scoops a bowl at a valley's head, a cirque polished like the inside of a spoon. Let the ice withdraw, and that bowl will cradle a cold, dark lake reflecting a sky that suddenly feels enormous. Beneath the moving ice, rocks are ground into flour. You could hold this glacial flour and think it smoke caught in your fingers. Powder so fine it hangs in meltwater, turning streams a milky turquoise. Coarser pieces ride along, too. Pebbles, cobbles, boulders, each one a memory of cliffs far away. When the ice pauses, it sets these memories down in ridges called moraines, low, wandering walls that mark an ancient shoreline of cold. When it retreats for good, the landscape is a low-relief map of motion. Drumlins, teardrop hills, aligned like brushstrokes, eskers, snaking ridges, where rivers once flowed inside the glacier itself, kettle lakes, water-filled hollows, where stranded blocks of ice slowly melted into the earth. Along coastlines where glaciers met the sea, ice-carved valleys deep below the waterline. When the ice let go and the ocean returned, those valleys became fjords, long fingers of salt water reaching inland between cliffs that still remember the weight above them. In some places, the land is still rising, a slow rebound from the burden of ice now gone. Stand on such a shore, and you can watch the tide, knowing the very ground is also moving, simply too slowly for human impatience to see. Winds played their part in this quiet rearrangement. As ice-ground dust lifted and traveled, it settled in faraway sheets of loess, pale, fertile soils that would one day help feed entire civilizations. It's a paradox the planet loves, an age of cold setting the table for later abundance. The same patience that carved valleys also prepared fields. The same stern wind that scoured rock carried the promise of harvest. Life followed the new shapes like ink in a watercolor wash. Salmon learned the timing of cold, bright rivers pouring from glaciers each spring. Forests recolonized bare ground in waves, lichen and moss first, then shrubs and trembling pioneers, then the steady architecture of trees. Animals traced corridors between lakes and along ridgelines, writing fresh routes into the map with their bodies. Humans read these lines too, traveling under stars and along river braids, learning which passes held late snow and which valleys offered sheltering windbreaks. What endures after the ice is not just the forms, the cirques, the moraines, the fjords, but the lesson they carry. That softness, repeated, remakes the hard. That motion, sustained, becomes design. If you've ever run your hand over a stone worn smooth by a stream, you already know this. The glacier is that stream's elder. When ice thickened on land, the seas answered by stepping back. Imagine the world taking a long breath in. Shorelines marched outward. Continental shelves became dry. Windswept plains and islands fused into larger bodies of earth. In that drawn-in tide, new paths appeared, corridors written not on any map, but on the seafloor itself. We call one of these Beringia, a cold, treeless steppe that once bridged Asia and North America. It was not a narrow causeway, but a vast country of its own, wide as a horizon and alive with hooves and breath. Mammoth, horse, bison, caribou, each riding their hunger across the grass. Here, winter ran long, but life made its bargains and kept them. Arctic foxes unspooled their tracks behind moving herds. Snowy owls pivoted in the wind, bright against the dull gold of dormant grass. In spring, the sky itself migrated, geese, cranes, and ducks threading ancient flyways, stitching continents together with sound. The land bridge was never empty. It was a thoroughfare, a meeting place, a living hinge on which two great faunas turned. Humans traveled here too, following game, following curiosity, following the simple need to see what lay beyond the next ridge. They did not rush across an open drawbridge. They lingered, learned routes, learned seasons, learned where river ice broke first and where driftwood gathered after storms. Some waited out the hardest cold on coasts where the sea was generous, kelp forests sheltering fish and abalone, tide pools offering their bright, salt gifts. Others threaded interior valleys, reading the sign language of wind-scoured snow. The world did not announce itself. It had to be read, and they became great readers. Sea level, like a steady tide pulled by the slow moons of climate, kept time. As warmth returned between glacial peaks, ice relaxed and seas rose, taking back their borrowed land. Estuaries filled. Bays reached inland. On flooded coasts, ancient river valleys transformed into long inlets, where the salt pressed upstream and mingled with fresh. In some places, the sea returned so far that what had been a day's walk became a boat's journey. In others, the ocean only lapped at the foot of new dunes. The map was a living manuscript, revised line by patient line. Even far from Beringia, the rhythm was the same. Australia stood farther from New Guinea and then closer again. Britain was once a peninsula, joined to Europe by a plain we now call Doggerland, where rivers braided through marsh and red deer stepped carefully over peat. When the North Sea returned, the plain dissolved beneath gray water, leaving fishermen of later ages to dredge up from time to time. A bone, a tusk, a fragment of tool, a small, mute biography of the drowned world. What these walking shorelines left us is both tangible and quiet. Tangible in the terraces and stranded beaches etched along many coasts. Quiet in the way human stories remember a flood, a lost meadow, a path that once was. They also left us with a way to imagine change as something more than loss. Between taking and giving, the ocean inscribed new edges, new fisheries, new harbors, new routes for light to glitter down long afternoons. Stand at any shore today and listen. Waves fold themselves one after another onto sand that has not always been here. The horizon is a boundary that refuses to be fixed. The world has always been making and unmaking its edges, patiently, beautifully, with a logic that lives on scales larger than ours, but no less intimate for that. Across the long, wind-combed grasslands, people made small, bright centers in the dark. Hearths cupped by stones, smoke winding upward to meet the stars. Around these circles, warmth held like a promise. Meat sizzled, fat popped. Snow softened near the fire, releasing the clean scent of water, and hands that had been numb found their work again, scraping hides, twisting sinew, mending seams. Clothing wasn't decoration. It was survival architecture. Needles carved from bone-threaded gut and tendon through fur and skin, shaping parkas, mittens, and boots that trapped a thin country of warm air close to the body. Every stitch extended the frontier of where a person could stand and call it home. Tools grew lighter and sharper, born from the same patience that shaped valleys. Cores of flint or chert yielded long, parallel blades, slivers no thicker than a leaf and wicked as frost. Set into wood or antler as barbs, they made spears and darts that reached farther and cut cleaner. Fire, too, learned new chores, hardening points, warming glue, loosening marrow, smoking meat for the long miles ahead. In the hush beyond the flames, dogs watched, partners with eyes tuned to the smallest motion, the faintest scent braided into the wind. Together, human and dog became a two-voiced hunter, each completing the other's sense. But even in the sternest seasons, beauty persisted, because meaning is also a tool. Fingers stained with ochre and charcoal left marks on cave walls. Horses galloping through stone light. Bison swelling with breath. Mammoths stepping in procession, as if the rock itself remembered them. In some shelters, the animals are so alive you can almost hear their hooves. In others, a spray of handprints feels like a roll call across time, saying, "We were here, we saw, we honored what we depended on." Bone flutes found far from any warm sea still carry their quiet music, 5 clean notes that turn cold air into a ribbon of song. Someone blew those notes to soothe a child, to steady a heart before the hunt, or simply because the night asked for an answer. Roots stitched the continent like hidden thread. Rivers were roads in winter, firm under sled and foot. In spring they became braided mirrors guiding travelers from valley to valley. Along coasts, rafts and skin boats rode the long lines where kelp softens the sea, carrying people between coves as the tide breathed in and out. Camps rose and fell with the herds and the seasons, but the knowledge stayed, passed mouth to ear like an heirloom, where ice breaks first, where driftwood gathers after storms, where berries ripen in the lee of a south-facing hill. Hope, in this world, was practical. It was a spare awl tucked into a pouch. It was a coal banked in ash before sleep. It was a story told carefully so the lesson would not crack in the cold. And over centuries, such hopes accumulated into culture, a quilt of skills and songs that let small bands move through a vast, demanding grace. They did not think of themselves as ancient. They woke, fed, traveled, rested, carrying winter and summer in their coats and bones the way we carry it in memory. Mammoths, with their sloping backs and great curved tusks, grazed the open steppe like living ships, sailing seas of grass from Iberia to Alaska. Close kin but not the same, mastodons moved among conifers and wet meadows, their molars shaped like blunt mountains for crushing twigs and leaves rather than the fine ridges a mammoth used to mill grass. Two giants, tuned to different tables, both at home beneath a low, bright sky. Steppe bison flowed in dark rivers along the horizon, heads down, shoulders rolling under heavy muscle. Woolly rhinoceroses, massive, two-horned, with coats the color of old straw, tilted into the wind, scraping snow aside to reach pale shoots. Farther south and west, cave bears slept away long winters in chambers where dripstone still remembers their turning. Cats kept watch. In the Americas, Smilodon's thick limbs and long, curved sabers spoke of ambush. Across Eurasia, scimitar-toothed Homotherium favored open ground and teamwork. Dire wolves moved in close-knit packs, reading the wind like a book. Each body was a ledger of bargains with the cold. Small ears to save heat. Dense underfur beneath longer guard hairs, to shed meltwater and resist wind. Fat layered where the air could not steal it. Even tusks and horns did double duty. Levers to pry snow. Signs that carried meaning across distance. Warnings, invitations. The quiet law of space and rank that lets great animals share a landscape without wrecking it. Around them, smaller creatures ran their own economies. Arctic hares flashed white across the crust. Lemmings pulsed through population booms that fed owls, foxes, and every hunter tuned to the snow's secret chambers. Ptarmigan wore seasons like clothing, brown where summer asked, white when winter required, leaving dotted quills as tiny testimonies that life is fluent. Humans moved carefully within this chorus. We learned the pace of herds, the swing of migration, the way a valley's wind tells you what passed at dawn. Stone became strategy. Delicate bladelets inset along antler and wood. heavy points for close work, bone toggles and foreshafts designed to flex rather than shatter when muscle met ice. Nothing was wasted. Hide became shelter and second skin, sinew, thread and bowstring, bone, awl and flute. Around the fire, elders mapped animals with words, where the bison prefer to cross after thaw, where a mammoth cow will lead calves when the gnats grow thick. Knowledge was meat you could carry without weight. To walk among these neighbors was to live inside a moving cathedral, pillars of horn and tusk, aisles of grass, a roof of weather that could turn from glass blue to iron in a breath. It was also to learn humility. A missed throw, a broken line in the snow, and the day could lean away from you. But success braided species together. Wolves shadowing herds opened chances for both themselves and the people who read their shadows. People, in turn, left bones and entrails that winter crows turned into black letters on the snow. What remains for us, now, are fragments. A tooth dredged from a river, hair lifted whole from permafrost, ochre silhouettes running across cave walls. Evidence that the distance between our lives and theirs is measured not only in years, but in the thinness of a flame cupped against the dark. At first it happens invisibly, snow lasting a little less long, a meltwater rill running a little longer into evening. Then the change gathers itself. Ice thins at the edges, blue light pooling in crevasses, as if the glacier were filling with sky. In summer, the surface sparkles with rivulets that find one another and braid into streams. Those streams vanish into moulins, deep, round mouths that swallow water with a sound like breath, and reappear at the glacier's foot as torrents cold enough to bite bone. Lakes collect along the ice front, clear as glass and held back by dams made of nothing more than frozen water. These are patient reservoirs of potential. Most drain quietly, skimming the dam's lip and etching new channels across outwash plains. But some, fed by seasons of melt and a warm rain at the wrong moment, press until the dam groans. Then they go all at once. Outburst floods muscle through with a strength that ignores our usual scales, ripping boulders from their beds, planing soil from hillsides, carving canyons in days that a river would normally need lifetimes to cut. When the water leaves, it leaves a signature. Giant ripple marks tall as houses, scablands scoured to raw basalt, boulders stranded like dropped punctuation on a page of sand. Even where no flood roared, the retreat was language written in layers. Each summer's silt settled into calm lakes in a fine, pale sheet. Each winter's darker dust laid itself gently on top. Count these paired bands, varves, and you can read years like rings in a tree. Far from the ice, rivers swelled with the gift and trouble of melt, spreading deltas into seas that were themselves rising to meet a looser world. Coasts uncurled, estuaries reached inland, salt and fresh rehearsed their mingled dance. The land answered with green. First lichens and mosses wrote soft, stubborn letters on naked stone. Then came willow and birch, quick to claim a summer and cast a thin shade. Later, heavier forests, spruce and pine where the air still held a memory of winter, broadleaf trees where warmth lingered, took their places, knitting hillsides against the rain. Animals moved with this green tide. Caribou tracked shrubs northward. Beavers found creeks and began their patient engineering, turning movement into ponds, ponds into meadows, meadows into new invitations for life. Humans followed water as faithfully as any salmon. We found fresh roots along rivers newly unbound, crossed passes that had forgotten their snow, launched skin boats into bays that had been grass not so long before. Where ice had scraped valleys clean, we learned the new winds. Where forests returned, we learned the shade. Camps that once crouched against katabatic gusts rose instead under trees that sang when evening settled, and beneath everything, the earth itself rebounded, slow, stubborn, inevitable. Freed from a mile of ice, the crust lifted millimeter by millimeter, as if standing up after a long wait. Shorelines crept outward against the same sea that was rising elsewhere, a quiet contest whose result still traces today's maps. Melting here was not an ending, but a rearrangement, a redistribution of cold into water, of water into river, of river into soil and sea, of soil into green. The world was not returning to some original self. It was becoming a new one, using the same old tools, time, motion, light. As the cold loosened its long embrace, the world shuffled its deck of paths. What had been a white labyrinth of ice became a mosaic of green corridors and blue roads. Rivers, once throttled by winter, ran clear and long, braiding through valleys like silk unwound. Lakes pooled in hollows left by retreating ice, bright as new coins. Between them, meadows stitched themselves across slopes, soft invitations to hoof and foot alike. The map did not simply open, it softened, the hard edges of survival rounding into seasons that could be planned for instead of merely endured. Animals drew the first lines. Caribou rehearsed migrations that would become tradition, swinging north in confident arcs, then south again with calves trotting close. Elk and red deer pressed into forests that were now tall enough to cast shade worth seeking. Salmon found their ancestral arithmetic, born in gravel, tempered by the sea, returning up the exact rivers that spelled their beginnings. Beavers moved in behind this procession and set to work on water's grammar, slowing current, raising ponds, widening wetlands where frogs told evening and dragonflies stitched light to air. With each dam, they wrote a small permission slip for more life to arrive. People read this new script by touch and by memory. We traveled where fishes thickened a river into song, where willows bent under catkins, where berry thickets promised late summer sweetness and bare caution in equal measure. We learned lake chains that turned months on foot into weeks by boat. Skin stretched over ribs of wood and thought. Kayaks, canoes, umiaks became our quiet machines, translating wind and arm into distance. The shoreline mattered in a new way. Kelp forests marked safe lanes. Points and headlands taught the wind's dialects. Tide calendars, scored into bone or held in a mine's reliable drawer, told us when to launch and when to listen. Trade widened its circle. Shell from one coast turned up far inland. Stone from a mountain's specific shoulder arrived at camps that faced only plains. Not just things moved, but stories and motifs, ways to lash a frame, to smoke fish, to set a net so it held but did not drown the river. A design scratched onto antler here found its cousin 100 valleys away. Knowledge, carried like a flame cupped in two hands, leapt ravines that feet would take days to cross. Forests learned to speak in layers. Understory plants scribbled quick notes, ferns unfurling, berries recruiting birds, while the canopy took the long view, counting in rings. Fire visited, sometimes kindly, sometimes not, resetting the conversation. In its ash, certain seeds found their cue. We watched and learned. When to burn lightly to invite meadow, when to leave the slope to its own patient counsel. Stewardship was not a slogan, it was supper, and still, winter returned, gentler but essential, sealing lakes with glass and weeding the careless from the careful. We banked food, banked stories, banked gratitude. In spring, melted edges reappeared first at north-facing shores, where the sun found a way through cloud and habit. Children learned to skip stones there. Elders taught them why this ice loosens sooner, how the light leans. The new world was not easier so much as more legible. The same forces, time, motion, light, wrote in a script we were learning to read aloud. If the ice had been a stern tutor, this was a mentor with a softer voice, no less exacting, no less beautiful. Long before ink held dates in rows, the night taught us how to count. On clear winter evenings when the air rang thin and the frost made every sound precise, people lifted their eyes and read the old clock overhead. Constellations were not merely pictures. They were milestones, familiar shapes walking the horizon, signaling when rivers would break, when herds would turn, when berries would bead along south-facing slopes. Orion's belt rose clean and cold, a hunter striding through the darkness. The Pleiades trembled like a handful of ice. The North Star steadied the compass of every journey with a promise that north would not slip away while we slept. Our ancestors named these arrangements and then braided those names to need. A certain star at dawn meant ptarmigan would be heavy with winter fat. A certain pairing at dusk meant fish were schooling just offshore, their bodies tightening the water into a darker blue. Through repetition, the sky became a ledger, its entries written in light and verified by the ground underfoot. Even the wobble of the seasons, earlier thaws, later snows, could be noticed as a change in when a familiar pattern arrived at a familiar place in the sky. To watch was to measure. To remember was to predict. The aurora, when it came, unstitched speech. Green curtains rippled like breath-given color. then folded themselves into spears of light that reached down as if to touch the ridgelines. Stories gathered around those nights, some saying the lights were spirits playing, some warning that whistling might draw them too close. Meaning was not decoration. It was how fear and wonder were made safe, how children learned to stand in beauty without turning their backs on caution. By day, the sun wrote a gentler script. Its shallow winter arc told hunters how much ground could be crossed before cold took the edges of thought. Its first warmth on a south-facing rock was permission for lizards to appear and for people to step out of the wind and feel their hands again. Shadows lengthened and shortened with a reliability that made tools of sticks and stones. A stake in the ground to mark solstice noon. A line of sight cut between two peaks to catch the year's turning. In camps that stood long enough for custom to take root, these alignments became small observatories, quiet agreements between earth and light that said, here is when to sow this, to dry that, to begin the long walk. Water listened to the sky as well. Moon pulled tide, tide braided with river, and along coasts our boats learned the body language of these forces meeting. The slap that means ebb is strengthening, the lift that means flood is sliding under. A knotted cord might carry the memory of springs and neaps. A carved tally on driftwood might hold the count of nights until safer passage. What the sky gave most of all was company. Under familiar stars, far from the last campfire's glow, people felt less alone. The same patterns had shown on their grandparents and would on their grandchildren. That continuity steadied the step. To know that Orion would always climb in winter was to believe that one could climb through winter as well. Long before ink drew borders, the world was carried inside the body. A path lived behind the eyes, along the tongue, beneath the ribs. You could give directions by pointing, yes, but also by singing. A mountain was not just height and shadow, it was a verse. A river bend was a change in rhythm, a safe ford, a soft refrain everyone knew. In winter, the song slowed to account for snow. In summer, it quickened where the ground was kind. To walk together was to harmonize, each voice keeping the others true. Landmarks became a grammar. A notch in the ridgeline said, turn soon. A trio of larches said, water is near. The way wind pressed low grass could warn of a marsh ahead. In fog, your feet learned to read slope and soil. Gravel under toe meant you were still on the old river terrace. Slick clay said you had dropped too far into the floodplain. Hands remembered as much as minds. The precise weight of a familiar stone used to crack muscles. The flex of a favored spear shaft that pointed you like a compass when you gripped it right. Stories carried scale. A tale about a grandmother's long walk to a salmon camp held inside its humor and weather. The timing of run and tide. The location of a sandbar that liked to move. The way the morning light on a particular cliff meant the channel would be calm until noon. Children learned these things while pretending to ignore them. Play was rehearsal for survival. Later, standing at the cliff, They would feel the recognition bloom, the world and the story snapping into one shape. Coasts taught another dialect. Foghorns were seals, kelp the green handwriting of safe water. On clear days, the line where dark ocean shifted to lighter green marked the edge of a reef that could tear a boat's skin. On gray days, cormorants perched like punctuation on the only rock that broke the surface. A palm dragged along a paddle's blade could taste the current, cold tongue from a river, warm from a shallow bay, telling you which way the tide was leaning beneath what the eye could see. Even the night had its cartography. The Big Dipper poured toward a pass. The Milky Way lay like a ghost river to be followed between two peaks. A bright planet at dawn meant your bearing was a little east of true. When clouds wiped the sky clean, you could still piece together a route by the smell of resin, pine against spruce, or the chirr of insects that prefer the drier south-facing slope. Nothing was solitary. Paths were braided with friendship and kinship, with trade and promise. A cache of dried fish tucked high in a birch was both food and message. Someone has been here. Someone thought of you. At the season's end, gifts moved the way water does, down gradient to where they were most needed, turning geography into generosity. If you could step into such a journey, you might notice how quiet it feels inside the knowledge. Decisions are small because attention is large. The land is a companion, not a puzzle. And when you arrive, when the mouth of the valley opens and the river lays itself out like a bright path, you understand that maps were never only about where to go. They were about who you were becoming while you went. How do we know a winter lasted longer than a lifetime? That a flood outran the memory of rivers? That grass once rolled where waves now write their patient script? Because the past keeps books, and the earth is full of librarians. Ice is the most obvious archivist. In Greenland and Antarctica, snowfall layers stack like pages. Bright summer, dim winter, pressed until air itself is trapped as bubbles. When scientists draw up a slender cylinder of ice, they lift calendars of light and breath, dust that tells of wind, ash that whispers of distant volcanoes, and the fragile ratios of oxygen that weigh the coldness of long-vanished winters. Even the exhaled balance of carbon dioxide and methane rides within. The planet's thin quilt recorded year by year. Lakes keep their own ledgers. In calm basins once fronted by glaciers, summer's pale silt and winter's darker dust settle in couplets called varves, a poem counted in pairs. Farther afield, wind-blown dust becomes loess. Fine, buff layers that drifted from ice fronts and stacked into hills, whose grains still remember the direction of an ancient wind. Rivers carry stories to the sea, where shells of tiny foraminifera fall like quiet snow. Their chemistry, tucked into spirals, encodes the temperature of the water they lived in. A seashell thermometer left on the seafloor. Forests and meadows send pollen to the archive, each grain with a distinctive shape, a pine's spiky ball, a birch's tri-lobed charm. Buried in peat bogs and lake mud, these microscopic seeds of identity accumulate into time series. Read upward and you hear the forest breathe. Spruce retreating, oak advancing, prairie grasses surging like a green tide when climate allows. In caves, drip by careful drip, speleothems, stalagmites and stalactites stack thin bands of calcite. Their trace elements and isotopes remember when rain came, how warm it was, whether storms braided the sky with a different thread. Stone itself can keep time. When ice withdraws from a boulder and sunlight first strikes it cleanly, cosmic rays begin a slow alchemy, building isotopes within its skin. Count those and you can say how long the stone has stood revealed, how fast a glacier stepped back. Charcoal tucked in ancient hearths or swept into flood layers carries dates in the decay of carbon-14, telling us when a fire warmed hands now lost to memory. In sands laid down by moonlit currents, electrons trapped in quartz grains glow when awakened in a lab, revealing how long it has been since sunlight last reset their clocks. Sometimes the records cross-reference one another. A thin ash layer, a fingerprint from a faraway eruption, threads through an ice core, a peat bog, a lake bed, aligning timelines across continents. Teeth and bones, lifted from permafrost and dated not just by chemistry, but by the DNA that persists within, place a mammoth herd or a human camp at a precise bend in the centuries-long river. All these pages together don't just say what happened. They say how fast, how often, how lives, ours included, braided themselves around rhythm. The miracle isn't that the past can be read. It's that the present, by listening, can become wiser. The world warmed, green rose where white had ruled, and with that softening came a hard truth. Some neighbors would not follow us into the new light. Across continents, the largest animals, the slow, thunder-quiet hearts of the steppe, thinned, and then were gone. Mammoths left their curved handwriting in permafrost, and then fell silent. Giant ground sloths no longer shouldered aside saplings. Glyptodons stopped rolling their armored moons across South American plains. It was not one place or one year. It was a long unspooling at the edge of winter's retreat. Why? The earth rarely offers a single answer. Climate changed the table setting, where grass had rolled like an inland sea, shrubs shouldered in, where cold had locked water, bogs and forests rewrote the menu. Animals tuned to wide, windy rangeland found themselves in patchwork, enough perhaps for a season, but less certain for a lineage. At the same time, new hunters, us, had refined patience into craft. Stone grew more articulate. Spears flew farther, truer. Strategies braided courage with cooperation. A single throw could not undo a giant, but a chorus of well-timed decisions could. Some extinctions feel like footprints that simply fade in rain. Others leave abrupt punctuation, kill sites where bones lie in patterns that speak of butchery. Tusks nicked by tools, the sudden absence of dung fungi in lake muds, a microscopic silence implying fewer great bellies moving across the grass. Taken together, the pages suggest a double pressure, habitats shifting beneath heavy feet, and those feet increasingly shadowed by people who had learned the animal's clock and corridors. Still, the endings were not everywhere the same. On small islands of time and land, Wrangel, the Taimyr Peninsula, mammoths lingered like late notes after the song has finished. In Australia, giants had already vanished before the last glacial maximum. In Africa and parts of southern Asia, where animals and humans had grown up wary together, many great species endured into the present, their caution and inheritance. What did such quiet departures mean for the living? Landscapes changed character. Without elephant-sized gardeners to push through thickets, some forests closed their doors to light. Without heavy grazers, fire sometimes took up their old role, resetting fields with flame. Rivers ran differently when beaver cousins were scarce. Seeds that once hitched rides in thick fur traveled fewer miles. Even wind learned new routes where grass no longer lay cropped and low. People read these changes and adjusted. We shifted our diets wider, learned the timings of fish and fowl with fresh attention, stored more for winters that now arrived wearing softer faces but could still bite. Stories took on a tone of elegy in places, remembering an animal so that its absence could remain useful. How to track what no longer lives becomes, oddly, a way to track everything else better. Extinction is a stern word, but this chapter is also about inheritance. The skills honed in scarcity, the humility learned at the edge of enough, the patience to rebuild knowledge when the world edits its own cast. To walk forward was to carry both grief and gratitude, both the weight of what had been lost and the lightness of what remained possible. When the cold loosened and the seasons steadied their breath, people began to linger. Camps that once rose and fell with migrating herds stayed a little longer beside good water, where reeds swayed and fish stitched silver letters through the shallows. Lingering changed our hands. We set stones in circles to hold down roofs, stacked food in baskets plaited from willow and grass, tucked embers deep so the same fire could wake again tomorrow. In that pause, we started noticing which plants returned where we spilled a few grains, which patch greened first after rain, which slope gave sweeter seed when harvested a little later. Curiosity turned into care. Stone told the story first. Grinding slabs grew shiny with use, their hollows polished by years of grain meeting pestle. Sickle blades, flint set into wood with sticky resin, came home burnished with a telltale gloss from cutting stems by the handful, not one by one. Storage pits deepened and multiplied, lined to keep out damp and teeth. We were still hunters and fishers and gatherers, but the gatherer's part extended its reach, asking, "What if we help the plants help us?" Seeds answered, held back from the cookpot and pressed into soft soil near the camp. They learned our rhythms as we learned theirs. Those that didn't shatter at a touch, those that clung to the head just long enough for human hands to carry them, were the ones we saved and planted again. Slowly, invisibly, grasses became grain, and grain became a promise we could keep. Along one sea, people tended barley and wheat on stony hillsides. Along another, rice found its reflection in flooded fields. Elsewhere, maize would one day climb toward the sun on sturdy stalks, beans twining up after it like a friend. Animals felt the tug of this new center. Dogs had long shared our fires, reading our eyes as surely as we read the wind. Now goats and sheep hovered at the edge of camp, learning the bargain of salt and shelter. Later, cattle's warm breath would fog morning air in courtyards, where children learned to spill grain for the birds and to be gentle with small lives. Domestication was not only about tool and seed, it was about time, about choosing to shape tomorrow with today's patient habits. Houses learned to stand their ground. Posts set in earth supported walls of wattle and daub. Clay, coaxed by fire, hardened into vessels that held water and held memory. The shape of a hand at the rim, a thumbprint where a maker steadied the pot. Hearths became both kitchen and clock. Bread baked, fish smoked. Herbs hung from beams like green script, curing into knowledge. In the cool of morning, women and men stepped into small fields and weeded in a rhythm that matched birdsong. In the evening, they returned with baskets heavy enough to make staying feel wise. The climate offered both kindness and tests. A long, soft warming taught us to invest. Sudden lean years reminded us that nothing is guaranteed. We answered with storage, with sharing, with maps of reciprocity, whose granary to knock at if a storm shreds your field, whose hands you will lend when theirs are needed. Villages became more than clusters of roofs. They were agreements. Looking back, it's easy to say we domesticated plants and animals. The truth is gentler and stranger. Tending them domesticated us, taught us patience, timing, restraint, taught us to trade wandering for weaving, to measure a year by sowing and harvest, as well as by stars and hoof prints. We did not stop moving. We began to move differently. Around a center we were learning to keep alive. Staying taught our hands new music. Where campfires once moved like migrating stars, hearths began to hold their places, and around them the ordinary miracles multiplied. Clay, kneaded with river silt and patience, learned to keep water, to cradle grain, to carry stew from fire to mouth without complaint. The first pots were thick and cautious, thumbed with fingerprints that still sleep under glaze. Then came thinner walls, wider shoulders, rims that poured without dribbling, skill accumulating the way rings gather in a tree. Fire turned from survival to craft. Kilns rose, at first nothing more than wind-shielded pits, later domes that breathed through vents like living things. Inside, clay reddened, then hardened into memory. On those warm vessels, people drew what mattered: reeds and fish, birds and spirals, the rhythm of a river seen from a hill. Designs traveled as surely as goods did. You could hold a pot and know which valley it came from, the way its maker's village hears rain on a certain roof. Thread joined clay in the toolkit of permanence. From flax along wet banks, from the soft undercoat of goats, from wool that caught burrs in early hedges, fibers became line, and line became cloth. Looms spoke an upright language, warp strung taut as promise, weft passing through like breath. Patterns held knowledge, borders that counted days, chevrons that remembered the bend of a nearby river, colors learned from plants that reveal themselves only to patient eyes. Clothing warmed bodies. It also announced kin and place, a quiet map worn on the skin. With storage and shelter came new forms of time. Fields asked for calendars precise enough to respect seed and rain. Stakes in the ground marked shadows at solstice. Doorways watched sunrise creep along a ridge and back again. Stones stood to catch the years turning, like an idea made visible. Markets learned a weekly pulse, baskets arriving at the open square filled with far tastes, salt from a dry basin, ochre from a cliff that bleeds in the rain, obsidian black as pooled night. Trade widened not only what we ate and wore, but what we knew about elsewhere. The smell of a cedar forest you've never walked. The call of seabirds you've never seen. Villages wove themselves from these threads. Lanes wandered between houses whose walls remembered every hand that packed them. Courtyards held drying racks, millstones, laughter. The small disputes of children negotiated under the impartial eye of chickens. Work specialized by talent and by love. One neighbor quick with fire, another with dye, a third whose bread never failed. Elders watched patterns not just in weather, but in people, naming what held the group together and how to mend it when it frayed. With closeness came friction. Rules surfaced like stones in a path after rain. How to share water, where the goats may graze. Who speaks when strangers arrive with baskets and news. Stories adjusted, too. The hero who once walked alone now learns to listen. The clever one who brought down a mammoth now learns to keep seed safe from mice and envy. New virtues rose to meet new risks. Fairness, foresight, the discipline to store in plenty and share in lean. Even so, the wild never left. At the edge of barley and beans, hedgerows hummed with insects. Beyond the last roof tile, the old path into the hills kept its shape. People still went out to hunt, to gather pine resin or mushrooms, to visit a spring known for its bright taste. The village was not a wall against the world. It was a conversation with it, steadier now but no less alive. In clay and cloth, in kilns and looms, we practiced what the ice had taught us. Small actions, repeated, become form. Patient motions, layered, become design. A neighborhood is simply that lesson, made of people. Clay taught us to hold water. Thread taught us to hold warmth. Then came a different lesson, hidden in stone until fire persuaded it to speak. In riverbeds and along red hills, people picked up rocks that felt strangely heavy, dark lumps that stained fingers and resisted the hammer's usual grammar. in hearths stoked hotter than cooking asked for, bellows made from skin, lungs patient and strong, those stones softened, then bled bright. The first pearl of metal slid free like a dawn pulled from night. Copper was the earliest voice, warm as old sunlight. Hammered cold, it took a dent and kept it. Heated and worked again, it became kinder under the hand. Beads first, small gleaming promises, then awls that slipped through hide without tearing, then hooks that held fish with a surer curve. Bronze arrived later like an answered prayer, copper alloyed with tin, stronger than either alone, a partnership discovered by trade and curiosity. Edges stayed true longer, bells rang clearer. A thin chisel could persuade wood to become a bowl as smooth as a thought. Metal changed not only what we made, but how we measured making. We learned temperatures by color, dull red, cherry, orange, the spectrum of readiness. We learned timing by sound, the hush when the flux had done its work, the singing quench that hardened a blade without breaking its temper. A village's map adjusted to include new rooms, smelting pits downwind, slag heaps glassy and green in sunlight, workshops where sparks walked across packed earth. Children learned to keep a respectful distance and a hungry eye. With harder edges came subtler work. Wood joined wood with tenons and mortises that fit like remembered hands. Stone learned from metal's example, too. Drills tipped with copper turned faster under the bow. Holes appeared where once only patience could go. Farmers cut furrows more efficiently. Carpenters raised beams that could trust their joints. Boat builders sealed seams with pitch and confidence, sending hulls farther along coasts already stitched by trade. Value began to travel as tokens, rings, blades, ingots, each carrying not just material but story. Who smelted it? Which mountain offered its ore? What promise was sealed when it changed hands? Scales appeared on market days, arms balancing seed against salt, cloth against copper. Fairness made visible. Measures settled into names and standards. A cubit became a memory of an arm, a handful, a customary scoop, a day's work, something a community could agree on and then teach. Metal invited memory in other ways. A thin stylus scratched firmer lines into wet clay tablets drying near the kiln's warm flanks. Knots on cords, tallies on bone, ochre on walls. These older scripts learned a new companion, marks pressed with intent to be read by absent eyes. At first, they counted goats, jars, sacks of barley, but every ledger that endures also whispers of more. Who owes whom, when to meet, which field lies fallow this year so it can breathe. And yet, for all this new certainty, the old rhythms kept steady time. Dawn still braided smoke into the sky. Evening still gathered hands around bread and stew. Metal did not silence the flutes or the looms. It tuned them, giving sharper tools to familiar songs. Fire, once only survival, had become memory. holding shapes the way a story holds meaning, so that tomorrow's hands could pick them up and continue. First, we counted with what we could touch: pebbles in a bowl, notches on bone, knots along a cord. But as baskets filled and trades widened, memory needed a firmer handhold. In warm rooms near kilns, where clay slept and woke all day, someone pressed a reed into wet tablets and discovered that marks could hold breath. A circle for a sheep, a wedge for grain, a cluster of strokes for 10. What began as tally grew into language you could carry across a season, across a valley, across the span between two people who were not in the same room. The stylus taught the hand a new patience. Wedges leaned left, then right. Lines stacked like careful reeds in a marsh. Cuneiform's soft geometry learned to speak of more than jars and goats, names, places, debts that became agreements rather than frayed recollection. Cylinder seals rolled their tiny worlds over clay, lions pacing, rivers winding, a god lifting one hand. Signatures that made identity visible and forgery difficult. In another country of light, ink met papyrus. In another, brush met silk. In yet another, cords braided numbers into the air as quipu, a different, but no less rigorous script. The point was the same, meaning anchored so it could be moved. With writing came calendars that did not slip, harvests promised to specific hands, journeys plotted with landmarks that someone who had never seen them could still find. Laws stood up in public places like stones. This is how we measure grain. This is what fairness weighs. This is where water must be shared when the river runs low. The village square learned to listen to words that did not evaporate when a voice grew tired. Stories crossed the threshold, too. Myths that once traveled only on breath, boat to fire, winter to spring, entered clay and ink. They did not lose their music. They gained new roots. A child could trace a hero's path with one finger and then carry that hero into a different century. History, which had been a chorus of elders and the geography of scars on a landscape, found a second spine. Names and dates lined up like stars you could steer by. There were shadows, as always. Writing could fix a lie as surely as a truth. It could harden a mistake into custom. It could be kept by the few and used as a gate. But even these risks taught counter skills: how to keep multiple ledgers in conversation, how to argue with a text without setting it on fire, how to teach letters widely enough that power had to listen. Craft answered with finer tools. Scribes learned angles and pauses the way singers learn breath. Ink recipes passed like heirlooms, soot and gum, iron and gall, the measured patience of a mortar and pestle. Brushes remembered wrists. Pens learned the weight of a thought. Shelves appeared, then rooms of shelves, then buildings where cool air and shade guarded pages from the small teeth of time. A city's memory could now survive a hard winter, a bad harvest, the loss of a voice that had once kept the whole story in its cadence. And yet, when you step back, The miracle remains simple. Sound taught to sit still, then to travel. The soft syllables we use to make a promise, to ask for bread, to call a child in from dusk, caught, shaped, saved, and sent. We had taught fire to remember shape. Now we were teaching marks to remember meaning, so tomorrow could start further along than yesterday managed to reach. Follow a river long enough, and it will teach you to gather. Water arrives with the steadiness of a heartbeat, carrying silt as fine as memory and laying it down in gentle breaths along its floodplain. Here, where soil is renewed as reliably as dawn, villages thickened. Footpaths grew confident. Fields arranged themselves like sentences that could finally be read without guessing. Along banks that gleamed at sunset, people learned the choreography of plenty. Sow, tend, harvest, store, mend the levee, welcome the flood, begin again. Rivers made engineers of us. We straightened channels that meandered too lazily. We braided smaller ditches from the main current to coax water where the ground ran higher. We built spillways and weirs that listened to both seasons and moon. In dry months, gates opened with a sigh. In the wet, they closed like careful eyes. Mud, once only a nuisance, became architecture. The bricks stamped and dried in rank upon rank, their straw temper glittering in afternoon light. Walls stood up, courtyards cooled in the shade. Streets learned to aim breezes down their narrow throats. From the air, which no one then possessed, these towns would have looked like woven baskets set gently on the earth. The wheel rolled out of such places almost as a matter of course. A potter's turntable first, a circle the hands could keep true. Then a heavier disc mounted on an axle, shoulders leaning into it with a grunt and a laugh when it actually moved. Sled trails became ruts. Ruts became roads. Roads became promises you could keep even in rain. Carts widened the radius of hunger and of help. Timber from farther hills, salt from shrinking seas, stone with an edge that made carpenters smile. Each arrived with less cost to the back and more joy in the work. Boats answered the road with their own logic. Hulls grew longer, keels deeper. A square of woven cloth learned to drink the wind and push a town's voice upstream or out to sea. Harbors organized themselves around this new grammar. Quays where rope bit into bollard. Markets that woke before dawn to meet the tide. Warehouses that breathed grain and cedar. A city's smell became a tapestry. Smoke and fish, damp rope, crushed mint from a herb seller's tray. Hot brick cooling after noon. With scale came administration, not as a weight at first, but as a relief. The same scripts that had counted goats now counted days of labor to lift a wall. Baskets of barley owed in exchange for seed. Jars of oil set aside for the temple's lamps, so the night would not feel empty. Seals clicked into place on storage jars, their tiny lions and rivers announcing whose care guarded whose food. Courtyards hosted disputes that ended with handshakes instead of blades, because a written promise could stand in the heat longer than tempers did. Altars rose where the city met its sky. We shaped stair steps toward the clouds, not to taunt them, but to remind ourselves to look up. Offerings were not bribes to heaven so much as acknowledgments. Thank you for flood and sun, for the peppery breeze that kept mildew from the grain, for the patience to try again when a storm forgot itself. Music climbed those steps, drums like footsteps of giants, flutes that threaded the clamor with a bright human line. None of this erased the older world. Hunters still left before dawn, shadows among reeds where cranes argued about the light. Shepherds still traced slow circles on uplands, reading weather by the feel of wool and the taste of air. Cities did not replace the wild. They negotiated with it, learned its moods, fenced its tantrums, and borrowed its abundance. At night, even the busiest quay fell hush enough that one could hear the river talking to itself, the same voice that had first persuaded us to stop and build a home that could remember us. Cities need something more than brick and barley to stand. They need trust that can be weighed. In shaded market courts, balance beams learn to speak. Stone weights, lion-shaped, duck-shaped, simple lozenges smoothed by many hands, kissed the pans, and grain whispered down until the arm steadied level. Fairness became visible, a line held in wood and metal. Buyers exhaled, sellers smiled. The city found a rhythm that did not depend on the temperament of the moment. Standard marks appeared like quiet stars. On bricks, a maker's stamp. On jars, a seal pressed while clay was still breathing. On cords, a knot that meant counted twice. Measures settled into a common tongue. A cubit promised the span from elbow to fingertip, but now it matched a rod in the temple. A mina or shekel, once a rough heap, became an agreed weight. Children learned their tables alongside their proverbs. Grain that cheats the scale will not bake bread that sits well in the mouth. Time, too, asked for keeping. In courtyards, obelisks and gnomons taught shadows to tell hours. Indoors, water slipped through clepsydras in patient drops that did not argue. Priests charted feast days by moon and sun. Builders scheduled crews by the length of morning cool. Scribes dated shipments so that a delayed boat became a problem to solve, not a rumor to fear. The calendar, once a song, now had margins. Coin arrived like a compact miracle, value hammered thin, stamped with a city's face. Before, trade had been a careful barter. Goat against oil, cloth against copper, trust braided through conversation. Coins allowed a widow to carry a roof's worth of reeds in a small purse. They let a mason store a season's labor in a shape that did not spoil. They also taught caution. Counterfeiters always walk in step with innovation. The city answered with edges milled, designs complex enough to make lies expensive. With these tools, law could stand up straight. Contracts moved from voices by a doorway to tablets stacked on shelves, each bearing two names and a simple ambition: to remember what was promised. Courts learned procedures, the order of speaking, the order of listening. Witnesses became pillars that held roofs of agreement. Oaths braided honor to consequence. Justice, imperfect as any human craft, nevertheless found a body. Judges with cool eyes, archivists with careful hands, penalties that sought to mend rather than merely punish when mending was still possible. The same scaffolding that strengthened trust also cast shadows. Debt could chain a life as surely as rope. Interest, like ivy, could climb until it hid the wall. In answer, jubilees were imagined. Years when fields rested and balances were forgiven. A reset button carved into tradition so that wealth could not drift endlessly in one direction without threatening the harbor. Markets needed mercy too. Yet walk the lanes at dusk and you'll see the best of it. A scale settles, a stringed instrument tunes, a baker counts loaves for the night watch. A boatman ties a knot he learned from his mother's hands. The city hums with agreements. This weight means this much. This mark means this was checked. This coin means you may go home with your basket and your day intact. Fairness is not a feeling here. It is a craft, measured and maintained. And in that craft, strangers can meet as neighbors for the length of a trade, and then over time perhaps for longer. When promises had to travel farther than a voice could carry, the earth learned new lines, roads unspooled from city gates like careful sentences, stones set shoulder to shoulder so wheels would hum instead of shudder. Milestones rose at measured intervals, each one a gentle reassurance. You are not lost. Someone has already counted this distance. At dawn, carts creaked into motion, axles greased, grain sacks snug under woven mats, while swallows practiced their low flight along the warm lee of the roadside wall. A road is more than a path. It is a decision repeated until it becomes durable. Builders shaved high spots, filled low ones, taught marshes to bear weight with layers of brush and stone. Where rivers objected, bridges negotiated, arches shouldering water's moods, pilings sunk into silt until they forgot the urge to tip. Inns gathered at day-length intervals, light flickering behind reed blinds, stew thick with lentils and rumor. Couriers changed horses with the efficiency of breath, document sealed, wax warm from a signet's press, the message now faster than any man who tried to chase it on foot. Walls answered roads the way ribs answer a spine. City walls did not only keep danger out, they gathered the life within into one bright pulse. Gates counted mornings and evenings. Watchtowers taught eyes patience. Farther out, long frontier walls walked the ridges, not as continuous denial, but as punctuation. Here the law shifts. Here the tax is owed. Here a signal fire will call riders if dust on the horizon looks wrong. On quiet days, shepherds dozed in their shade. On busy ones, merchants lined up with crates of glass and jars of oil, scales clinking as officials checked the tidy arithmetic of empire. Water traveled too, learning stone the way a song learns harmony. Channels slipped along contour lines, then leaned out over valleys on aqueducts, bridges for thirst. In the loud heart of cities, fountains spilled into basins where children's laughter made a market of the morning. Sewers, invisible but faithful, taught refuse a path that did not cross breads. Power grew less about thunder and more about maintenance. Roads needed tending, walls needed patching, bridges needed a mason's honest hand. Scribes charted crews the way farmers charted irrigation. Send men here when the rains have passed. Ship stone there before the river rises. Pay in coin and grain so hunger doesn't come to work with them. A state's true anthem was the sound of many small competencies interlocking. Yet every improvement widened the world's conversation. Caravans stitched deserts to coasts, carrying frankincense and mathematics, lapis and lullabies. Pilgrims walked toward holy places and came home with new recipes and kinder ways to greet strangers. Teachers packed theorems and proverbs into saddlebags. Doctors swapped herbs and cautions across languages. Roads that carried troops could also carry mercy in a bad harvest. Grain moving downhill to hunger the way water seeks low ground. Shadows traveled too. Along these same corridors came taxes that bit too hard, plagues that leapt from cough to cart to city gate, gossip that soured into fear. But even then, the scaffolding lent us answers. Quarantines announced from walls, relief wagons counted and sealed, beacon chains signaling calm after a storm. The machinery of reach could be a balm as well as a blade. Stand at a milestone in late light and listen. Carts whisper by, sandals lift dust. A distant hammer rings as a mason finishes the day's last stone. Roads are memory laid flat. Walls are memory stood upright. Together they let a promise leave the mouth that made it and arrive, still itself, where it is needed. Where roads ended in surf, another kind of sentence began. Harbors curled like commas in the coastline, pausing the long thought of travel so that goods and stories could take a breath. Mornings smelled of tar and damp rope. Gulls stitched white punctuation into the air. Under sheds dark with salt, shipwrights read timber the way healers read a pulse, listening for knots that would argue, choosing grain that bent without breaking. Keels learned to draw a clean line through water. Ribs rose like the memory of a whale. Planks took their places with the snug logic of trust. Sails taught towns to converse with invisible things. Cloth, woven tight and quiet on land, became eloquent at sea, bellying when the wind agreed, flattening when it sulked. Ropes learned names. Halyard, sheet, stay, syllables that turned panic into action when weather changed its mind. A crew's choreography was a map without ink, hands to braces, eyes to telltales. A heel of the deck that meant reef now, even before the captain spoke. The ocean had its own calendar. Along certain coasts, winds reversed each half of the year, exhaling one way, then drawing back. The world's long breath written in monsoon script. Merchants timed their departures to this tide of air, leaving when the wind would carry them out, and returning when the same sky, faithful to its appointed turn, would carry them home. Elsewhere, a daily sea breeze came inland like a polite guest at noon and retreated at dusk. Even such small reliabilities multiplied courage. Navigation began as memory and became more. Pilots hugged the coast, keeping landmarks like old friends. A cliff shaped like a sleeping dog, a stand of darker pines, a hill that caught sunrise sooner than its neighbors. Farther out, the night offered instruments made of light. Constellations walked their routes. A bright star steadied the north. A pale river of Milky Way could be followed like a road. On cloudy passages, sailors listened to water, the slap that meant shoal beneath, the long, even stride that meant deep. Later, a sliver of magnetized stone learned to favor one direction, and a floating needle remembered that lesson even when the sky hid its face. Lighthouses were promises hammered into rock. By day, a tower to aim for. By night, a pulse of fire speaking the harbor's name in intervals. Long, short, long, so a boat could recognize home by rhythm alone. Bells beat warning in fog. Horns shouldered sound into the milk-thick air. At the dock, bollards waited like patient shoulders. Knots rehearsed their small mercies, a loop that would hold, a hitch that would release even when rain had tightened everything else to stubbornness. Cargo made a marketplace of the horizon. A hold might smell of cinnamon and cedar, wine and wool, copper and dried fish packed in clean straw. Crates traveled farther than their makers ever would, carrying not only goods but techniques, words, recipes, gods with pockets full of small comforts. Ports became dictionaries where languages borrowed each other's best phrases, loanwords polished by many tongues until they fit everywhere. Risk traveled the same routes, reefs sharp as unkind thoughts, storms that unstitched plans, calms that stranded ambition under a sky without breath. To answer, people invented redundancy, a second anchor, a spare spar, a prayer engraved on wood. Logs kept by the helmsman turned a voyage into a ledger. Winds noted, currents suspected, kindnesses recorded so they could be repaid in some later, lonelier bay. Stand at the end of an ancient quay at dusk. The water darkens to ink. The lighthouse writes its patient beat. A late boat ghosts in with sails half furled, hull whispering secrets to the pilings. You can feel how a city's heart extends beyond its walls, along ropes, across wakes, into the open sentence of the sea. Bronze rang bright, but iron arrived like a deeper note, harder to coax from stone, yet steadier once won. In clay furnaces that glowed like small suns, charcoal and ore argued all night. At dawn, a blacksmith lifted out a spongy bloom, a dark heart shot with sparks, and began the old conversation. Heat, hammer, fold, again, again, impurities fled under rhythm. Strength gathered under patience. The forge became a room where time itself seemed to breathe in bellows and exhale in the anvil's clear reply. Iron changed the day's work before it changed the world's borders. Plowshares cut soil that bronze only worried, turning heavy fields that had long kept their secrets. Hoes bit deeper. Sickles kept their edge through a longer row. Axes taught forests to make space for terraces that walked hillsides like careful stairways. With each sharper bite, fields widened, seeds multiplied, granaries filled with a confidence that could carry a bad season on its back. Surplus is not a feast. It is a calendar that can afford hope. The village map adjusted. Smithies took their place near water and wind, their rafters filmed with soot that smelled of concentration. Children learned to listen for temper. The hiss that means quench now, not later. The dull clang that confesses a hidden flaw. Iron nails stitched beams more honestly to stone. Hinges gave doors a smoother grammar. Knives turned chores into gestures. What had once taken a morning left an extra hour for mending nets, for stories, for sleep. Forests felt this new appetite. Charcoal asks wood to remember fire, and furnaces asked for much charcoal. People answered with care where they could. Coppicing groves so branches regrew, moving kilns so one hillside could rest while another worked. In the best seasons, metallurgy learned to live like a thoughtful guest. In the worst, it forgot itself and bit too hard. Even progress must keep a conscience. On roads and in armories, iron took on other shapes. Rivets held wheels that carried farther. Tire bands kept rims from splintering under weight. Helmets and mail learned to spread a blow's bad news across many rings until it faded. Spears trusted their points to stay true. Yet even here, the forge's truest gift was less war than reliability. A latch that never failed in rain, a chisel that held an angle through stubborn stone, a saw that sang the same song on the first beam and the last. Knowledge thickened around heat. Smelters compared ores by smell and spark, bog iron from wet meadows, red hematite from honest hills. Fluxes, limestone, shells, were fed to the fire like small spells to draw the slag away. In some valleys, artisans stumbled into steel, carbon wandering into iron's lattice to make a blade that could hold a whisper-thin edge. A beggar's knife and a prince's sword differed in polish and story, but both were born from the same patient grammar of flame and strike. If you stand outside a smithy at dusk, you can feel how this quiet revolution moves. The pulse of the bellows, the brief, bright bloom each time the door lifts, the silhouette of a person teaching stone to remember a sharper kindness. Iron did not make us louder. It made our work more faithful, our calendars more forgiving, our households a little more at ease. Across high deserts where the wind writes in sand, across mountains that hold winter in their ribs even in summer, a thin, shining thread pulled cities into conversation. Call it silk if you like, a fabric light as breath, strong as promise, but the road it named carried more than cloth. Caravans moved like patient punctuation, camel after camel, bell after bell. Men and women wrapped against dust and sun, leading wealth that did not glitter until a loom or a kitchen or a mind revealed it. At dawn, the caravanserai opened its wooden mouth, and travelers flowed out, saffron and paper, glass that trapped light, lapis the color of deep water, pepper measured in heartbeats because a single pinch could change a winter. In the courtyards at night, languages braided without arguing, each borrowing the other's best words for bread, for love, for the angle of a roof that does not leak. Maps were folded into stories. Stories were pressed into memory. Memory was parceled out into advice. Leave before the sun looks fully awake. Trust the spring behind the third stand of tamarisk. Listen to your lead camel when the dunes begin to lie. Horses learned new power with a small invention, a pair of loops that let a rider stand and strike or simply spare his knees. The stirrup turned balance into authority and distance into something softer. Yokes changed, too, from a strap that bit a throat to a collar that spread the load across the honest strength of a chest. Plows grew broader shoulders and fields widened further. Bits of metal and wood altered the way whole continents spoke to grain. Ideas packed lighter than spices and lasted longer. Paper slipped from one river valley into others, easy to make, eager to be written on. Bound books replaced scrolls in places, turning a long ribbon of meaning into pages you could open anywhere and feel at home. Numbers traded shapes. 0, humble, round, miraculous, joined the conversation, turning accounts from piles to proofs, astronomy from guesswork to geometry you could test against the sky. Religions traveled with the caravan's shadows. A shrine's small candle lit a monastery's great lamp. A pilgrimage's worn sandals carried herbs for a foreign soup, and a parable fit for a different hill. Differences did not always soften on the road. Sometimes they sharpened. But even quarrels along a trade route learn a slower temper, sanded by the need to share a well and a shade tree. Danger had its stalls in every market. Bandits who listened for the jingle of coin in saddlebags, storms that remade a pass overnight, taxes that leaned too hard on a weak season. Answers traveled the same paths, guilds and letters of credit, patrols and flags on distant hills, news that outran rumor by a day and saved a caravan's year. Stand on a ridge where two valleys meet and watch the line moving, beads on a string, each bead a family's hope, a city's appetite, a scholar's bright question. Silk is what the hand feels. The road is what the heart learns. That distance is smaller than we think when we carry one another's best work carefully across it. When roads and sea lanes began carrying more than goods, when ideas themselves traveled with caravans and hulls, the world learned to build rooms where thought could winter well. Lamps burned late over tables crowded with pages. Courtyards held the murmur of languages learning to share a mouth. Call them academies, libraries, scriptoria, madrasas, monasteries. Each was a shelter for questions that did not fit inside a single lifetime. In river cities and desert capitals, translation became a craft as exacting as metalwork. A line of Greek took on an Arabic heartbeat. A Sanskrit treatise donned a new alphabet without shedding its proof. Persian tales found fresh music in another grammar. Scribes bent close, comparing two meanings the way a jeweler compares two stones. Where are the fractures? Where does the light pass truer? Margins bloomed with notes, corrections, doubts, small celebrations when a stubborn sentence finally revealed its shape. Knowledge that had scattered like migrating birds began to flock on the same page. Numbers learned to flow more easily. The simple courage of placing a small circle where nothing belongs. 0. Let merchants, astronomers, and dreamers keep books with a clarity that felt like cool water. Columns aligned. Errors confessed themselves. Calculations walked farther without losing breath. Algebra learned to speak of the unknown as if it were a familiar guest. Let X be the thing we seek, and let patience invite it to show itself. In courtyards open to the night, observatories lifted careful instruments toward the turning sky. Astrolabes, brass maps of heaven, helped sailors find noon and scholars find prayer's appointed hour. Tables of stars thickened with entries, a planet's wandering corrected, an eclipse timed more honestly than rumor's breath. Calendars lost their wobble. Crops and ceremonies took their cues from records that respected the sky's true pulse. Elsewhere, medicine moved from charm toward chart. Hospitals became public promises, baths of light and water, wards divided by ailment rather than fortune, pharmacies that smelled of mint and myrrh. Physicians kept case notes the way navigators keep logs. What was tried, what soothed, what failed, what a different teacher once observed in a different season. Anatomy remained a whispered frontier, but pulse and fever, diet and rest, these learned to sit in an orderly conversation where evidence could be welcomed. Paper multiplied mercy for the mind. Cheaper than parchment, more forgiving than clay, it let copies travel like seeds on wind. A text no longer lived or died by a single shelf. It could walk in many directions at once, finding students in towns that had never seen the country of its birth. Along the same shelves, poetry leaned against geometry, law against love stories. Librarians learned to arrange neighbors who argued without shouting. In the best of these houses, argument itself became a virtue, structured, courteous, relentless. Teachers welcomed students who would surpass them. Errors were not sins. They were stepping stones, labeled and left in place so no one had to splash in the same cold water twice. Across faiths and frontiers, a quiet fraternity formed. The brotherhood and sisterhood of those who feel night as an invitation. If you stand in such a room in your mind, you can still hear it. A reed pen scratching, a page turning, a low voice reciting a line until it lands. Outside, the city breathing its ordinary breath while Inside, tomorrow is being made sentence by careful sentence. Some inventions do not roar, they whisper, and the whisper multiplies. In quiet rooms that smelled of oil and ink, letters learned to become seeds. Blocks of carved wood pressed whole pages at a time. Later, tiny pieces, each a single sound given a body, stood in tidy rows and kissed paper with news, prayer, jokes, laws, recipes, dreams. A page that once took a day now took a breath. Words that had lived as rare birds began to flock. Ink made a soft music, the thrum of a press, the creak of a frame. The approving sigh of paper lifted free and hung to dry like laundry of the mind. Almanacs marked the year with moon and sewing. Broadsides argued under doorways. Slim books traveled in saddlebags beside bread and a knife. A printer's shop became a crossroads where shoemakers and scholars met in the same queue, where a boy sent to fetch a notice might leave with a poem humming in his pocket. Time, which had been a matter of bells and shadows, learned a steadier pulse. Water measured hours in bowls, then gears took over, trading the drip for a tick. Teeth easing past teeth, a small, forgiving arrest that made minutes behave. Towers lifted faces to the town and kept count aloud, so a baker knew when to bank his coals, and a mason when the afternoon was half spent. In workshops, little clocks leaned against windows, their hands rehearsing patience. At sea, the wish grew to make distance and time agree, so that a course could be drawn with more than hope. Glass joined the conversation. Sand and fire, taught to be clear, became lenses. The near grew nearer for tired eyes, and the far grew full of secrets when two curves held the sky in focus. Books that once blurred at dusk were readable again by elders. Tiny things, wing scales, seeds, the embroidery of frost, suddenly belonged to a world we could visit. Far things, mountains on the moon, wandering points that resolved into worlds, announced themselves like neighbors finally stepping into the light. Maps learned to keep up. Lines once sketched from memory now traced coastlines with a surer hand. Grids and rum lines taught sailors how to lean boldly into open water and still arrive. Atlas pages turned like slow adventures, a river braided differently than rumor said. A gulf deepened into color, a margin crowded with careful notes. Beware shoal here, sweet water there, good holding ground in northerly winds. With every copy made, silence lost a little of its monopoly. Women taught daughters to read by the hearth. Apprenticed boys learned to spell between deliveries. Elders who had kept epics alive by breath found friendly companions in pages that would not forget when sleep came early. Newsletters rode post roads. Letters of love and ledger shipped on the same coach. Coffee houses and courtyards turned into low, constant parliaments, where the town tried on tomorrow's ideas in today's voices. Of course, power noticed. Licenses, bans, and stamps tried to teach words where to sit and when to be silent. Sometimes they succeeded. Often the whisper found another alley, another door. A printer learned to hide a form beneath a flour sack. A reader learned to pass a page and keep a secret. Truth and mischief traveled together. So people learned the older craft of judgment, weighing a sentence the way a merchant weighs spice. Does it ring true? Is it cut with sawdust? Does it smell like the place it claims to come from? If you stand in a print shop in your mind, you can feel it. The page warm from the press, the slow turn of a gear, the lens winking at a sunbeam, the town clock clearing its throat at the hour. The world had found ways to copy itself more faithfully, and with that, to imagine itself more freely. There is a moment when water learns to push. In kettles and boilers, heat persuades calm liquid to become impatient vapor, molecules flinging themselves apart with enough eagerness to move iron. Harness that eagerness in a cylinder, guide it with valves and pistons, and you have a new animal in the world. An engine that eats coal and exhales work. At first it pumped water from mines, rescuing men from the slow drowning that had limited our appetite for the depths. Then it pulled carriages across land faster than a horse could dream, and later it drove ships against wind and tide, writing straight lines on seas that had insisted on curves. Coal, a dark inheritance from ancient forests pressed under stone and time, became a kind of condensed dawn. Sunlight saved, then spent in a rush of heat. Towns clustered around seams and ports, their nights glowing the color of hammered copper. The air tasted of iron filings and ambition. Hammers no longer waited for arms. They fell with the measured fury of steam. Looms learned a new rhythm, threads flying in rooms that sounded like rain on a tin roof. A day's work swelled, then changed shape entirely. Speed redrafted the map. Where canals had taught water to climb hills, railways now taught iron to dance. Tracks stitched villages to cities with a confidence that made distance smaller, markets wider, and news quicker. A letter that once rode a horse for days could now arrive between two suns. A crate of apples could outrun its own ripening. Stations rose like new cathedrals, glass and rivets and timetables, where people learned to read platforms the way they once read rivers. Stand here, and the world arrives. Power stepped indoors and multiplied. Rotating shafts and belts turned single engines into many hands. Saws that did not tire. Presses that did not forget their pressure. Fans that moved air in summer basements. Light, at last, began to answer darkness with a switch. The hush before a filament woke like a held breath. Then the gentle roar of brightness. Even nights changed their mind about what belonged to them. But every gift cast a shadow. Smoke shouldered into the sky and forgot how to be shy. Rivers ran warm and gray where mills rinsed their speed. Streets learned a cough. Work compressed itself into shifts that ignored the wisdom of dawn and dusk. And the clock, once a friendly chime in a square, learned a sharper tone in the mill. Children who had known fields came to know floors. Hands that had known tools learned tasks. We answered slowly with laws, shorter hours, safer rooms, windows that opened, schools that kept childhood from being traded too cheaply for bread. Engines changed how we understood effort. A farmer could thresh in an afternoon what once took a week. A printer could fill a town with pamphlets, then a nation with books. A knitter's design could bloom on 1,000 shoulders in a single season. We learned to think in scales, kilowatts and horsepower, tons per day, passengers per mile. We learned to think in systems, coal to boiler, steam to piston, piston to wheel, wheel to timetable, timetable to city that now expects oranges in winter and a morning paper at 6. Stand by a track at twilight and feel it. Before you hear the engine, you feel the tremor through your shoes. Then a headlamp rounds the bend, a bright coin pressed into the evening. The locomotive breathes, great, even breaths, and the carriages follow like thoughts persuaded by a single, powerful idea. Steam curls into the cooling air and becomes cloud again, as if to remind us that even our most insistent inventions still speak the language of water and light. First we taught water to push, then we taught lightning to carry meaning. In low rooms that smelled of shellac and dust, copper wire unspooled like tame rivers, and a simple key, pressed, lifted, pressed, turned silence into a code. Dots and dashes leapt across hills faster than any hoof, news arriving still warm from the mouth that spoke it. A storm at sea, a birth in a far city, a peace agreed at noon. Now the world could learn it before the day cooled. Poles walked the roads like tall shepherds, each bearing a flock of lines. Across plains, over mountains, under streets, the web thickened until distance felt thinner in the hand. Under the sea, cables were laid like careful stitches. Ships dragged grapnels through night-black water. Men bent over coils in lamplight, and at last a whisper passed from one coast to another, then answered. Oceans were still oceans, but their loneliness changed. Voice followed code, as if wires had grown ears. A transmitter hummed, a diaphragm trembled, and a laugh could cross town without legs. Switchboards bloomed, wood, cords, lamps, where operators learned the choreography of connection. Plug, ring, smile, one moment, a gentle click that braided 2 lives for a few necessary minutes. Whole cities learned to say hello as an opening door. Power no longer lived only in mills and engines. It moved into walls and learned to wait behind small porcelain buttons. A turbine in a river valley made night in a far apartment steady and bright. The argument between ways of carrying current slowly settled into grids that pulsed like new circulatory systems. Substations beating gently in fenced yards, while neighborhoods exhaled relief. Light at a finger's ask, heat without ash, motors that spun washing tubs and fans that lifted afternoon's heaviness. Waves joined wires, unseen, generous. A spark gap hissed, an antenna listened, and information turned to air. Radios learned to catch stories raining from the sky. Weather for fishermen before dawn. Music that stitched 10,000 kitchens into one room. Voices that could comfort a farm miles from any lamplight. Beacons began to sing to ships and later to planes, steady notes in fog and cloud, a compass made of sound. Time itself tightened. Railroads had already taught towns to meet the same minute. Now clocks synchronized by signals learned to agree across whole countries. Factories set their whistles by a tone from a distant observatory. Market bells rang together. Even lovers, separated by a city, trusted that at 7 the same hour bloomed in both windows. Shadows traveled with these gifts. Storms took lines down in tangles. Frost crept into cable housings. A misheard code could change a price, and a crossed connection could break a heart's sentence in two. Lightning, invited indoors, sometimes forgot its manners and bit. We answered with fuses and grounds, with crews who climbed in rain, with habits, insulators, gutters, careful rotes, that taught energy how to live among us without reproach. Stand at the edge of a town just after sunset. Lamps bloom one by one like cautious stars, then gather into constellations. A street, a square, a single high window where someone reads. If you listen, you can hear the new planet we have made. Soft hum of transformers, far-off clatter of a telegraph still tapping in some faithful corner. A radio's thin melody turning distance into company. We had taught messages to fly. Then we taught ourselves. Cloth stretched tight over ribs, engines coughing into courage, wheels bumping along rough grass until the ground let go. Flight began as a held breath and became a language. A wing learned to take pressure on its back and ease it below, carving lift from the pressure of air itself. Pilots discovered that the sky has roads, invisible rivers called currents, stairs of warmer and cooler layers, corridors of calm that open at dawn and close by afternoon. Clouds stopped being only decoration and became grammar. Cumulus like friendly punctuation, anvils warning of sentences that end in thunder. Airmail stitched towns together in hours instead of days. Bags of envelopes, light as promises, leapt mountains that had bullied caravans for centuries. On the ground, postmarks learned to keep up. In the air, beacons winked from hilltops. Then radio signals drew straight lines through night and fog. Cockpits filled with new instruments, altimeter's patient breath, compass card turning like a thoughtful coin, horizon gyros that kept their balance even when a storm tried to argue. Pilots read weather by touch, the tremor that means ice building on a leading edge, the loose, roomy feel of air warming after rain. Airports grew into modern harbors, runways pointing into prevailing winds, towers with windows like attentive eyes, lights that bloom in precise colors when twilight tucks itself in. Schedules taught cities to think in departures and arrivals, in connections that could lace two continents together over breakfast. Time zones, once a railroad's discipline, became an airline's heartbeat. A person could wake in winter and land in summer, could cross a language before lunch and learn grace by dinner. Metal replaced fabric. Jet engines replaced props with a long, steady thrust that wrote new scales across the map. The world shrank in a way that was not only geography, but family. Distant grandparents became weekend visits. Fruit that remembered a different sun arrived still fragrant. Students carried notebooks full of hometowns into classrooms that learned to pronounce them softly. The sky was no longer a ceiling, it was a commons. Flight also taught us to look down with kinder eyes. Aerial photographs turned rivers into lines of calligraphy, fields into quilts, cities into the geometry of our appetites. Cartographers gained new truth. Planners saw where roads choked and where green still threaded a way through gray. Later, as radar learned to feel through weather and satellites took their unblinking seats above the weather's arguments, the planet's pulse became visible. Storms spiraling, currents curling, forests greening and grieving with the seasons. We could watch ice breathe again, now from above, and understand our part in its shallows and surges. Shadows flew with us. Contrails stitched cold into blue. Noise learned to crowd quiet valleys. Fuel turned to exhaust that forgot where to settle. We answered with better engines, smarter paths, patient agreements in rooms where maps covered entire walls. Stewardship followed speed into the sky, learning to balance necessity with courtesy. Stand by a runway at dusk. A line of edge lights hums like grounded stars. Wind cranes the grasses. Far off, a fuselage gathers itself into a single bright intention. The wheels lift. For a breath you feel our species tilt, lighter than we were a century ago, still wary, still learning, but willing to trust air with our weight. Rockets began as fireworks, brief astonishments blooming over courtyards, and became arguments with gravity that the sky eventually conceded. Stack cylinders of fuel and fire. Teach valves to time their courage. Shape an arrow whose only destination is farther than before. A countdown quiets 1,000 hands into one breath. Engines wake like captive thunder. The tower falls behind, and for the first time in our long story, the ground becomes optional. The first machines to escape did not carry hearts, only instruments and hope. They learned to fall around the world instead of back to it, discovering the neat secret we call orbit. Keep missing the ground in a circle. From that patient falling came a new set of tools. Weather satellites looked down and taught us to see storms as spirals, to prepare not by rumor, but by image. Navigation birds climbed into well-timed paths, their clocks so exact that a receiver in your palm could triangulate a life, field, street, harbor, home, by listening to their steady song. Earth itself became a measured thing, shapely in numbers. Mountain heights truer than myth. Sea levels plotted as lines that move. Ice edges traced like the breath of a sleeping giant. Then we taught vessels to carry breath and bone. Capsules the size of small rooms, clad in ablated courage, rose on spires of combustion. Inside, checklists, pencils with cords, a window round as a pupil. Astronauts learned to float, a verb that felt like a sacrament, and to work in a choreography where every tool has a tether and every action a counteraction. Outside, Earth turned, polished and blue, clouds unfurling like silk. Borders retreated to the cartographer's books where they belonged. We went to the moon, someone would later say, and discovered the Earth. The moon's stark grammar, black sky, white dust, shadows sharp as edicts, answered an old human question with boot prints and a flag that lay still in airless noon. But perhaps the most important cargo those flights brought back was perspective. Photographs of a world small enough to cradle in a gloved hand, large enough to carry every story ever told. Later probes walked farther than footsteps could, past Mars's rusted deserts, through Jupiter's auroras, between Saturn's rings like a harp you could nearly hear. Some turned to look back one last time, sending a portrait of our home as a pale, deliberate dot suspended in a sunbeam. Back on the ground, space quietly entered the ordinary. Crop forecasts sharpened. Ships found safe water in pea-soup fog. Planes learned to trust a glide path whispered from space. A hiker's phone mapped a trail that elk had known for centuries. Even our grief found uses. Satellites watching fires so crews could meet them intelligently. Monitoring drought so food could move before hunger did. The sky became an infrastructure. Shadows accompanied the ascent. Debris threaded dangerous beads along useful orbits. The radio hush of wilderness grew crowded. The same images that informed could mislead in careless hands. We answered with agreements, with better deorbit burns, with astronomers asking for darker skies, so the universe could keep its privacy, and our children could keep their wonder. Stand beneath a night where a satellite passes, steady, unblinking, a thought made metal slipping from west to east. Somewhere, someone is using that whisper to find their way, to call home, to learn the weather of tomorrow's courage. Away, it turns out, was never the point. Away was how we learned to see here. After we learned to fall around the world, we taught sand to think. In quiet, clean rooms where air is a discipline, wafers of silicon took on patterns finer than pollen. Tiny gates that open and close at a rhythm too quick for pulse or clock. A transistor is a modest thing, a switch that obeys whisper small voltages. Pack millions, then billions, onto a chip, and you get a new creature. Logic at lightning speed, memory that doesn't blink, patience measured in uptime rather than temperament. Wires became light. Glass threads, thin as a hair, learned to carry whole conversations as rivers of laser pulses, on, off, on, each blink a syllable, each second a library. Under oceans, cables stitched continents into a single breathing paragraph. Across cities, routers and switches shepherded packets the way skillful herders move flocks. Split here, rejoin there, always toward home. Protocols taught strangers how to agree, how to introduce themselves, how to listen, how to retry kindly when the message stuttered. Screens turned into rooms. A face appeared from another hemisphere and laughed in your kitchen. A classroom unfolded on a twilight bus. A marketplace widened until a craftsman's bowl could find a table an ocean away. Search engines learned to sweep the shelves of the world. Maps recalculated when we missed a turn, unembarrassed, generous. The web became an invisible loom, weaving work and play, love and learning into a fabric that could stretch without tearing if we remembered how to hold one another's weight. Inside this new commons, languages met and traded tools. Open source code carried the old caravan's ethic. Take what you need, leave it better. Add a note so the next traveler doesn't stumble where you did. Datasets grew into telescopes for patterns too large or small for eyes. Machine learning, models trained on piles of human weather, began to guess, translate, summarize, recommend. Sometimes it surprised us with grace. Sometimes it mirrored our worst habits back at scale, reminding us that a machine cannot correct what we refuse to correct in ourselves. Electricity's geography shifted. Data centers hummed like modern monasteries, vast, cool, contemplative, devoted to keeping thought available at the speed of need. Their appetite for power taught grids new choreography. Their warmth asked for rivers and wind to help carry the cost. Efficiency sharpened into an ethic. Fewer watts per question. Fewer seconds of waiting per kindness. Stewardship followed the cable, as it once followed the road. Shadows also gathered in this bright weave. Misinformation learned to travel faster than memory. Privacy thinned where convenience pressed too hard. Outrage discovered the accelerant of 1,000 unconsidered clicks. We answered with older tools, patience, verification, humility, and newer ones. Cryptography that keeps promises, moderation that prefers repair over spectacle, norms that make space for silence again. Still, the astonishment remains. A child in one room can ask a question and hear, in an instant, the composite murmur of a species answering. A baker can learn a new braid before dawn. A doctor can read a paper from a distant ward between rounds. A lonely heart can find a choir. The network is not a place. It is a way of being less alone. If you listen at midnight, you can hear it. The faint, even breath of servers. The click of a key in a room where someone is learning. The soft thud of a package at a door, promised by an invisible conversation between maps and wheels. We have taught signals to carry care. If you hold the story of us up to the light, you can see the same filament running all the way through. Ice taught us patience. Fire taught us memory. Clay and thread taught us to keep shape and warmth. Roads and harbors taught us to hit the stranger without fear. Writing taught sound to sit still. Presses and clocks taught time to cooperate. Steam taught distance to yield. Electricity taught voices to fly. Wings taught maps to redraw themselves. Orbits taught a way to reflect here. Circuits taught sand to think. Each invention was not a replacement for the world, but a new way to listen to it. and to one another. What remains constant is smaller than any empire and larger than any season, the quiet craft of paying attention and the discipline of repeating small kindnesses until they become structure. A stitch becomes a seam a shirt, a winter survived. A survey becomes a canal, a harvest, a harvest, a lullaby sung with a full belly. A note in a margin becomes a method, a field guide, a forest that returns. The long thread is not technology itself, it is care. We have always been apprentices to the planet, learning its tempos, borrowing its materials, training our hopes to fit its laws. When we forgot that apprenticeship, the bill arrived. Smoke that didn't blow away, fish that didn't come back, glaciers that learned to let go too fast. When we remembered, even briefly, the world answered with the same generosity it always has. Wetlands knitting storms into gentler weather, forests catching carbon like a familiar ball, soils mending under kinder hands. Stewardship is not a grand speech. It is a calendar of habits. Stand for a moment, where all our paths meet. In a night room, a soft light, a page or a screen, a breath before sleep. Somewhere far off, a radio buoy blinks, a satellite crosses, steady as a bead on a string. A wind farm turns moonlight into a hum your ear can barely find. Somewhere near, a kettle ticks as it cools. A child turns in a warm bed. A neighbor's footsteps pass and fade. The old world and the new are not enemies. They are pages in the same book, and we, briefly, are the fingers turning them. The future is not a place we discover. It is a tool we make, like a pot that fits the hand that will hold it. We will still need fire, but wiser. Metals, but gentler. Roads, but softer on the land. Code, but kinder to the minds that read it. We will still need stories, especially the kind that enlarge our patience. Stories that remember how glaciers move, how seeds wait, how cities listen to rivers, how a promise can travel farther than a voice if it is written down with care. If you feel small in the face of it, good. Small is where everything begins. A seed, a sketch, a question. The first careful knot in a net that will one day feed a village. The earth has never asked us to be perfect. It has asked us to be attentive, to practice, to repair what we can, and to hand the long thread forward with our best instructions tied to it. So rest now, knowing that you are part of the same patient lineage that walked out of ice and into light, that tuned wind to cloth and sand to thought, that made rooms where questions could live through winter. Tomorrow, pick up the thread again. Tie one honest knot, then another. This is how worlds are kept.